Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Gresham College. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Keith Kendrick. I was a former professor of physics between 2002 and 2006, and I'm now an emeritus professor of the college. And this is the third of a series of lectures that I've been giving, looking really at fundamental and also clinical advances in neuroscience, particularly as far as up to date as I can get. And this lecture differs from the other two that I've given in that it's much more speculative. I also hope you'll find it perhaps a little bit more humorous as well, because we're now going to be doing very much some sort of looking into the future, which is exactly what the title suggests. So future brain, this is going to be crystal ball gazing. I've decided to say what might or might not happen over the next 25 years. It's a fairly arbitrary time period, but frankly, if you go much beyond that, then you'd be a fool to sort of have any reasonable prediction as to what may or may not happen in terms of discovery. And the field is moving incredibly fast. And that's really what I want to try and give you a flavor of. I don't know how long it will take some of the things I'll discuss really to take place, but they will. And we are going to really have a very different understanding of the brain over the next few decades, which will change our lives. Now, I could talk about all sorts of areas of neuroscience, and we'd be here for quite a long time. This actually happens to be my 30th Gresham lecture, so either I have an awful lot to say, or hopefully what you'll take home from that is there's an awful lot going on in neuroscience. But I'm going to just focus on a number of areas, not perhaps where the next super magic pills are coming from, but firstly, a better understanding of how we're going to get it, of how the brain functions in both health and disease. New ways to modify brain function for therapeutic purposes, particularly non-invasive ones, and the use of the brain to control external devices, brain-machine interfaces, as they're often called. I won't actually give you a lot of mathematical modeling because it's likely to get extremely complex, but nevertheless, underpinning a lot of neuroscience advance in the next few decades will be a huge interaction that's going on between neuroscientists, mathematicians, and computational scientists particularly. And not in fact as science fiction as you might think, design of brain-like computers. So let's start with recording brain activity changes. Clearly, if we really want to understand more about how the brain works, we have to be able to record its activity and try to make sense of what it's doing at quite a detailed level. And we're now beginning to get the kind of technologies that allow us to really interrogate brain activity, to give us some kind of chance, really, of beginning to understand how such a complex organ is functioning. I'm sure most of you have heard of brain imaging. This is a magnetic resonance imager, where we can do functional magnetic resonance imaging studies to look at indices of brain activity changes at increasingly high resolution. This is, in fact, so you're looking at activity using a massive magnet, and this is a 7 Tesla magnet, which is actually becoming pretty routine now in MRI, but in fact there are magnets up to 12 Tesla. They're not yet used on humans. There are some issues about whether they might have effects on these huge magnetic fields on the human brain. But the advantages of these very high magnetic field strength machines is that you can get down to a kind of millimeter resolution within the brain, or even less. And that starts to allow us to tease out changes in quite complex groups of nuclei, like, for example, the amygdala, where the nuclei themselves can be quite small, but they all do slightly different things. Another major advance, and we'll come back to this a little bit in a minute, is up until recently, it's been very much an offline type analysis of brain activity. You took the scans and then you did averaging, and you kind of worked out after the person had their scan what's going on in the brain. But now with advances in really analytical methods as much as anything else, it's actually possible to put somebody in an MRI scanner and get real-time feedback, which allows you, because therefore, to, as it were, instruct the subject to do things, or for them, for example, to try and control their own brain activity, which I'll come back to in a minute. Another method, it has both the fMRI and also this one, magnetoencephalography, where again you're measuring magnetic fields, but in this case you're measuring cortical fields at a high density, much more than you do with normal electroencephalography. But again, you have to be in a very highly expensive piece of machinery, and you have to be totally still. And this is one of the big drawbacks to these kind of technologies, that you have to be able to design experiments where a human subject can be sitting inside one of these machines, but they have to be totally still, at least with their head. They can do things with their hands, and they can speak, but their head's got to be still. And that has a certain amount of limitations. This has meant that, particularly for the development of brain-machine interfaces, a less high-resolution type methodology has been developed. I've called this whole sort of part of the talk shining light on the brain, because it's using light to look at brain activity or even influence brain activity. And this is near-infrared spectroscopy, where you're either measuring thermal changes or you're measuring hemoglobin changes as a measure of activity. So you're shining lots of lights in the brain, and that allows you, the infrared wavelength, and that allows you to image the general brain activity changes, not anything like as acutely or accurately as you can with fMRI or MEG, but sufficiently so that an individual doesn't have to be totally still. And indeed, a Japanese company is now actually producing these kind of head things where you're doing this kind of recording with somebody moving around. Light is also playing a very big role, really, in fundamental neuroscience, and this is perhaps one of the so-called hottest areas of neuroscience at the minute. It's much talked about, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's a very, very interesting technology called optogenetics. But in this case, what you're doing is you're putting into the brain opsins, or channel opsins, light-activated molecule genes, which you can attach to the membrane of cells. You use a viral vector to get them into the brain. And then when you shine a light onto neurons that are expressing these opsin genes, you can switch them on or off. Alternatively, you can actually also, down the line, use this same light-activated change in neurons to, for example, switch on and off genes that you've put in there. This is potentially a much more powerful technique than just electrical stimulation, and you can stimulate quite wide areas of the brain, which is obviously not possible with a single wire electrode, for example. And the only real disadvantage at the minute is that it's using fairly standard wavelengths of light, and you have to actually get the light source to activate these opsins directly into the brain, so it's still fairly invasive. But perhaps down the line we'll be able to find ways of shining light down into the brain that do not necessarily involve putting down a probe directly into brain tissue. And here's some examples of where we might be going. In my last talk, I talked about the fact that there's been quite a large increase in the amount of deep brain stimulation research for the treatment of Parkinson's, but also depression. This is clearly a very invasive technique, but we're beginning to understand which parts of the brain you need to stimulate in order to overcome some of the symptoms of these disorders. It would be nice if we were able to do this in a much more non-invasive manner. And there are already technologies where we could at least envisage, they're not currently being used routinely, in order to target brain areas using either infrared pulse laser, focused pulse microwaves, or alternatively using focused pulse ultrasound. So that there could be ways of stimulating deep brain structures physically without putting electrodes into the brain. So what about being able to read what you're seeing, thinking, feeling from recording the activity of the brain. This is clearly an area that disturbs people, and the cartoon up here is of a young lady walking down the steps at Wimbledon, and what other people around her may or may not be thinking, and perhaps you would argue we don't really want to know these kind of things. It would open up a whole can of worms. But nevertheless, we are making sufficient advances in reading brain activity profiles and analyzing them in order to start understanding what people are indeed thinking and feeling. In my first lecture, I actually gave an example of a recent study which allowed individuals in a vegetative state and apparently unconscious to communicate with individuals in the outside world. And this used a very simple idea that you get different patterns of activation when you're imagining, for example, walking through your house, so spatial imagery, as opposed to, for example, playing tennis. You get completely different patterns of activation, and they found that a few of these vegetative state patients were actually able to do this, even though they apparently couldn't communicate in any other way. And using this, they were then able to ask some simple questions, either yes or no, using, for example, yes, you want to activate the motor imagery, and no, the spatial imagery. So this is a very crude way of obviously interpreting what's going on in the brain, but it can be very well demarcated, the kind of patterns of activation you see. Much more controversial was in 2005, a very influential paper came out claiming that you could detect people who were lying from their fMRI scans. So perhaps, a real example of Pinocchio with his nose, and you look at one pattern and you're guilty, and another pattern and you're innocent. This was the paper by Langloban in Human Brain Mapping in 2005. And they were claiming up to about an 80–85% success rate of being able to determine people who were being deceptive. It's been tried out several times in court. It's never actually become, as it were, admissible as evidence. But as time goes by, it is likely that the technology will improve, and it's not beyond possibility that in 10–20 years, certainly the lie detector polygraph will have gone out, and that routine brain scans may actually be used to determine whether someone is telling the truth or not. What about knowing what somebody's looking at? This is a complicated slide, but it doesn't really matter too much. What happened in this study is they're looking at the visual cortex, which is imaging the visual cortex, which is processing a load of pictures, anything up to 1,000 different pictures in the sets they're giving. And they are using various methods in order to analyze the brain scans that come out, either from single trials or repeated trials, to see whether they could accurately predict which picture the subjects were looking at. And for sets up to 200, 300, they had, in fact, up to a sort of 70–80% success rate, and that will improve. That's already fairly amazing that they can detect which picture you're actually looking at out of quite a large set. So, yes, you can envisage down the line that when you've forgotten your car keys and you know it's somewhere in your head, and you go along to have a scan, and yeah, you get the information you want. Your car keys are under the sofa. However, you might get information you don't want people to know, which is that in this case, this gentleman likes to wear women's shoes. So what about learning to control or heal our own brain? Clearly, there's a huge amount of interest in any kind of sort of self-healing potential, and there are advances occurring very rapidly now which make this into a real possibility down the line as far as changing brain activity is concerned. Here's a recent study. Again, it looks very complicated, but it's a study where they're imaging particularly the right insular cortex, which is particularly important for responding to emotive stimuli and negative emotive stimuli, such as angry faces or disgusted faces. And these subjects in this were shown these faces, and then they were given feedback. Well, they had to actually control the levels of their activity. This is a real-time fMRI study to try and boost the activity themselves of their cingulate cortex. So they literally have to look at like a sort of indicator as to how well they're doing in increasing the activity of their right and insula. And they can do it during the experiment. And the result of this is, you can see down the bottom here, is as you increase the bold activation in the MRI, they're actually reporting even more negative responses towards these emotive pictures. So you're actually capable of changing the activity of one of these areas very important in controlling emotional responses. And you can turn up the gain with feedback in this particular area. So you can change your emotional response. This is even more complicated. This is so-called metacognitive awareness. That is aware of your thoughts and attending to them and turning them off and on, which is a problem we very often get, of course, in some psychiatric disorders, not being able to do that. And here again, it's real-time fMRI, and the individuals are getting feedback to help them, and this causes an increase in the activity in one of the very important areas for these kinds of meta-awareness behaviors, the frontal cortex, as you go across training sessions. But you don't get that where there's no feedback given. So it doesn't appear that there are any aspects of even higher brain function which are not susceptible to being affected by feedback training. And real-time fMRI has been very useful in allowing us to reveal these. It's not the only approach, though. This was quite a widely reported study in Nature last year, where in this case they have patients who are actually being treated for epilepsy, but in order to understand what's going on in their brains before they actually have surgery, they have an array of electrodes, recording electrodes, implanted into the affected area. And for a period of a week or so, that actually allows them to take part in neuroscience-type experiments. And in this one, they're recording from areas of the temporal lobe that particularly respond to high-level images. So in this particular case, it's the images of particular famous people. And the ones they chose, you probably can't read them here, is Venus Williams, Josh Brolin, Marilyn Monroe, and Michael Jackson. It doesn't matter who they are. But this is a very interesting task that they gave them. Here they have single neurons now we're recording from in either the parahippocampal cortex, and this single neuron responds preferentially to Marilyn Monroe. Okay? It doesn't respond to Josh Brolin. On the other hand, you have another one over here in the right hippocampus, and that one responds preferentially to the face of Josh Brolin and not to Marilyn Monroe. The subjects are then given a composite image of both Josh Brolin and Marilyn Monroe to view on their computer, and their task is to increase the activity by their own thoughts of the neuron that's responding to Marilyn Monroe, and they get the feedback as to how well they're doing by the fact that this composite picture becomes deconvolved, so it becomes progressively like the target image, which is Marilyn Monroe. And as you can see, over a period of trials, they're quite capable of doing this. And there's one that's switching from this to Marilyn Monroe, and on this side it's switching into an image of Josh Brolin. And when they're successful, you can see there's activity changes. If they don't actually manage to do it, there are no activity changes. So, yeah, it sounds a bit sort of strange that we should be so interested in this, but the fact that you can change the activity of these high-order neurons in the temporal cortex, just single neurons, by feedback is quite telling in terms of what we might be able to achieve down the line in altering brain activity for therapeutic purposes. One of the areas that is a particular focus, I mean, I've been talking about activity pattern changes in the brain, and then I've started talking about single neurons. But one of the areas that's very exciting in neuroscience, it's been known about for a long time, but we're now beginning to get a handle on understanding what the various rhythms, electrical oscillatory rhythms of the brain are doing. And they are performing extremely important functions of coordinating activity either locally or across wide areas of the brain. And you have different rhythms in different states, all the way from very low frequency rhythms like delta, around at 1 or 2 hertz, up to gamma, which is a high frequency from about 30 to 70 or even higher hertz. And sometimes we've found that these high frequency rhythms are actually coupled with low frequency ones, so they seem to be working together. There's been a lot of research now establishing that these rhythms are changed during learning and various conditions. I showed in my original talk, this is some of my own research. It's actually done on sheep. It's a complicated slide, but we are looking at both a fairly low frequency rhythm, theta, and the high frequency rhythm, gamma. And we know that gamma is coupled with theta, and this just plots the learning of a face discrimination trial that the sheep are doing, and the changes that occur as a result in theta-gamma coupling, the ratio between theta and gamma, the amplitude of gamma and also of theta. And you'll notice that as the animal learns, which is that 50% they don't know what they're doing, by the time they get up to 80% they really know what they're doing. They're choosing one picture over another to get a food reward. That there is a correlation, positive correlation between performance and the changes in these aspects of oscillatory rhythms. This just shows it in a pseudo-color manner over here in real time. So as soon as the animal actually learns, so they go from 70% up to 95%, suddenly you get increases in theta amplitude, which is what this color bit here shows, and also in theta-gamma coupling, and also you start to get changes in the ratio of theta to gamma, and these strengthen as learning progresses. And we have been able to model this kind of change, what causes the coupling of theta to gamma, in a formal way. Very simple circuits need to be involved, and we've been able to model how these are affected by learning using the molecular players in learning, particularly the glutamate receptor, the NMDA receptor. And this is the kind of approach that is very much going to be important in the future, that you look at biological information, you find effects, and then you generate models in order to formally describe what is going on and also predict things that you can't necessarily do yourself with recording experiments. And these, of course, will be the building blocks that are used to train any artificial devices to work like brains. This is another study showing learning. This is recording either high frequency or low frequency oscillatory activity, but just plotting it in terms of levels of activation by the pseudo-color scale here. This is a very simple motor learning or movement learning task, and I'm sure many of you will know from training in sport that you can actually imagine yourself doing activities, and that's actually a very important part of training. And if you look at the activity patterns as you get in motor areas of the brain, when you're imagining a particular set of movements, they're not as strong usually as the real movements, but they're nevertheless same pattern and a degree of almost the same level of activation. But if you give the individuals feedback as well while they're imagining what they're doing with their motor, you can actually improve the level of activity in both the high frequency and the low frequency bands beyond what you would get with normal movement. So you can improve with feedback these kind of changes in oscillations as well. One of the interesting findings, which still poses more questions, but it also shows why looking at these kinds of oscillations is going to be important for us down the line, is particularly Ulhaas and Singer here, have been looking at the changes in gamma power, that high frequency power, also beta, which is slightly lower frequency. And they find that there are changes during development in gamma power, such that particularly when you reach adulthood, there's an increase in gamma power, and there's also an increase in the synchronization of beta. And in general, what they're showing is that as you go through adolescence, there's an increased synchronicity in these brain oscillations. And as I'm sure you know, there are a lot of psychiatric disorders particularly, but others as well, tend to start off in adolescence. And it's notable, as I'll show you in a minute, a lot of these disorders are characterized by changes in these oscillatory rhythms. And this is an example from the same group, in this case in schizophrenia, you can see there's a reduction in gamma power in patients with schizophrenia, and a change in the beta frequency as well, which is just shown schematically down here. So there's also examples of this from a number of other disorders like depression. And this whole field has kind of led to what you might say is kind of fringe medicine, although those who obviously practice it wouldn't agree with that, where a number of disorders, notably attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also autism, there have been papers showing, and they don't tend to be published in the major journals, unfortunately, that there are measurable changes in high and low frequency rhythms in the activity or the brains of, for example, children with ADHD, and that by simply recording from a very few sites on the scalp here, you can pick up these rhythms, and then you give them a feedback task where they learn to control, they learn to increase or decrease the activities of these particular rhythms. And the feedback is, in this case, they're seeing a DVD of Toy Story. When they get it right, the DVD plays. When they don't get it right, it stops. And over about 25, 26 sessions, this is Swingle, who's published a book on this kind of research recently. It's kind that they can actually get control of these brain rhythms, and it's been reported that there is improvement in their behavior. It is emphasized, however, by all of the people practicing this, that you need to do other things as well. It's not just this feedback task. But it begs the question, since we already know that there are changes in these brain rhythms which are occurring, we don't really understand them well enough yet, but perhaps this kind of biofeedback task may well be very, very useful for treating various disorders down the line, but we really do need to understand a bit more about what's going on, and maybe this is a rather simple version of doing it. And there are very eminent people who treat ADHD who think this is all a placebo effect. So it is quite controversial. But I hope from the kind of evidence that I've shown you already, maybe it's not so controversial as you might think. And that down the line, if we do understand a bit more, it becomes less of a black box, and we can really understand what's going on, what's altering these brain rhythms, then the basis for altering them and hopefully affecting behavior will be somewhat more accepted. I just showed this to really convince you how amazingly adaptive the brain is. This is a CAT scan, and you can see this individual over here, this black area here is nothing. This is a brain scan, right? This individual has virtually no brain. That brain is right on the periphery here, just a couple of centimeters right under the skull here. Now, this individual is actually a French civil servant and does have a low IQ, but is still managing to survive. This is caused by hydrocephalus, but it happened over a very long period of time. And because it occurred over such a long period of time, this individual was actually capable of or the brain was capable of adapting and allowing them to lead a relatively normal life. And in general, if you give the brain enough time to adapt to various insults of it, then it can perform quite remarkable feats of overcoming dysfunction. Unfortunately, most of the things that we all know about, the time course is too quick for us to be able to adapt properly. However, although there's a huge amount of talk about the therapeutic use of neuronal stem cells in treating a large number of disorders, all of these most of these studies are talking about actually putting stem cells into various regions of the brain to cause regeneration, for example, in Parkinson's, to cause regeneration of dopaminergic neurons, for example. But in fact, the brain has its own neural stem cell population, and there are a couple of structures that are involved in various aspects of learning, like the dentate gyrus, and also, in fact, in odor recognition, the olfactory bulb, that do actually show routine evidence for what we call neurogenesis, production of new neurons. And that seems to be very important, in fact, within these structures for the process of learning. But there are also large numbers of neural stem cells in what is called the subventricular zone, which is the lining of the cerebral ventricles. And when you have a damage to the brain, these actively track into that area of the brain and attempt to repair it. Now, we all know, of course, that clearly their actions are, in most cases, insufficient when you have large amounts of brain damage. But, of course, there is huge interest in the possibility of, as it were, boosting the activity of these, as it were, self-repair systems within the brain, so that perhaps they could react to damage in various structures in a more effective way. So this is likely to be another big area of advance in the next 25 years, trying to, as it were, control the activity of self-repair mechanisms within the brain to help deal with progressive damage, particularly. So, what about using the brain to control external devices? I like this one, I just had to put it in. You know. Mind over matter may not be quite as important as mind over bladder as you get a bit older, but nevertheless, we are seeing increasing amounts of evidence of being able to record the kind of brain activity that I've been talking about in order to control either prosthetic limbs, for example, but also completely other devices like robots. This is the example I gave in, I think, my second talk, where this lady is fitted with a sort of robotic arm, and she's controlling this through links to nerves in her chest, which she can control, obviously, with her thoughts. And this kind of advance is going on very rapidly now, particularly, of course, with amputees. This is even more, if you want, controversial. It's only ever been, it's a study on one particular individual who is mute. And here they've implanted electrodes into speech areas of the brain and recorded the activity of these and passed it through various analytical systems to drive a speech synthesizer. And this individual was able to therefore use, with feedback obviously from the synthesizer, and hearing what it was saying, or hearing what they were producing, recognizable speech through changing the activity of the speech centers of their brain, which is quite remarkable. It's actually, PLOS One is maybe not the best journal in the world, but it's kind of, it does almost beg a belief, but it's certainly the kind of things that I expect to see happening with neuroprosthesis of all sorts of kinds over the next 25 years. And indeed, there was a very big review in the Annual Reviews of Psychology just last year, looking at all the kinds of different things we might be able to do with particularly individuals with paraplegics in order to use the recordings from their brains to, particularly obviously I think using near-infrared spectroscopy, but also perhaps just standard EEG as well, to control a number of external devices, including the TV. And yep, there's a lot of work going on in developing brain-machine interfaces which are not in the therapeutic context. They are recording, again, this is with near-infrared spectroscopy, and this individual's brainwaves are being recorded in order to control, this is the Honda robot over here, and they can do quite successfully. So this is very much an area where a lot of effort is being put into. It's still relatively early days, but nevertheless, it is possible to control very complicated robots using input from human brainwaves. Yeah, us guys might be happy with wearing these kind of things, and one can see in the future that perhaps the ladies might want something more ascot-like looking in terms of at least a little bit more pretty if they're going to have their brainwaves recorded. And yeah, there's an app for it already. iPhone is selling this thing called X-Wave, where you can control the iPhone. This thing is recording electrical activity from your brain. I have no idea how successful it is, but if you want to flash out $100, you can find out for yourself. It's obviously a rather simplistic approach, but clearly it's attracted this kind of level of attention already. And yeah, who knows? It might even improve interpersonal communication, which, let's face it, sometimes does seem to be at an all-time low. For those of you who don't speak German, this is simply means, how are you? So, can we construct new brain parts or even an artificial brain? Now we're really getting into what you might consider more science fiction, and you can read the cartoon for yourself, but it could be really put in a sense of humor if you don't have one, or help you with tone deafness, give you some spare parts. And these are often called neuromorphic approaches, and in a sense there are really three basic approaches that you can use. The first is to make existing computer technology simulate brains, and there's quite a lot of work being done with that. And the second, related to that, is to say, no, existing computer technology doesn't cut it, it's not good enough really to emulate a brain, so we need to develop new technologies using more brain-like components. Okay, so that's the first kind of approach that's going on. Second, although I won't say much about it, is actually clearly very, very important, because we need to be able, if we do make success here, to be able to, as it were, integrate these kind of chips into activity of the brain. So it's creating hybrid systems using neuronal and in silico components in order to interface between brain and computer. This is already going on to a large extent. I already showed you an example of that, where you already can see that, for example, with cochlear implants and retinal implants, where you're putting in electrode arrays in order to record the activity of nerves and then translating those into digital devices. Down the bottom here is perhaps even the most scary one, is to make an organic type brain, either based on current biological principles, neuron synapses and so forth, or perhaps other novel approaches. And we have many potentials from, for example, polymer chemistry and molecular physics. So this is Henry Markram. He's director of the so-called Blue Brain project in Lausanne in Switzerland. And some 5 or so years ago, he set up a unit out there, and they got hold of access to a massive IBM supercomputer. And their aim is to model and simulate very basic building blocks of the cortex of the brain. So this is columns, a column structure in the cortex. And yep, they're making progress, but so far they've got sort of past first principles, and there's certainly a huge amount of modeling going on, and they've got the computing power to do this kind of thing, but they're using, of course, conventional computers, and to do that you need to use already supercomputers. So that's the kind of, that approach is going on, and we'll see what it actually produces. But for those of you who know probably far more than I do about computers, but nevertheless, one of the big differences between computers and neuronal-based systems is that computers process information first, and then they shift it off physically into separate registers. And that slows things down. It also increases the amount of space and power consumption that you have to use. And it actually is a limitation to current computer technology. Neural networks both process and store information in the same place, or they can do. So that's a big difference between brain-based systems and computers, which allows computationally the brain to do, in a relatively small size, as much as a supercomputer that would fill 2 of these rooms, and will actually consume probably 1 million times more power. And the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the USA, of course, is currently spending millions of dollars on this particular scheme. It's called Systems of Neuromorphic Adaptive Plastic Scalable Electronics, or SYNAPS for short. They obviously chose the acronym very carefully. And this program is aimed to develop brain-inspired electronic chips that mimic the function, size, and power consumption of a biological cortex. And grants, million-dollar grants, multi-million-dollar grants have already been awarded to IBM, Hughes Research Labs, and Hewlett-Packard. They are working together with academic partners, but these are the companies are spearheading this. As you can imagine, this is potentially a multi-million-dollar commercial gain if they can be successful. And one of the big changes that's occurred, which will make this much more easy, is the discovery of, as it were, a new electronic component. We've known about resistors, capacitors, and inductors for a long, long time, but on the basis of, theoretical basis, this gentleman here, Leon Chua, in 1971, predicted that there must be another form of component. And this turns out, he describes it as a resistor with memory, a memristor. It's a device that can actually change its length according to the amount of current that's being passed through it, and therefore change its resistance. It's also sensitive to what direction the current goes. The memristor, it has this amazing ability to be able to, as it were, remember what charge is being passed through it and alter its resistance. And the important thing is that it remembers that resistance even when the power is turned off. So it's effectively a sort of non-volatile component. And in theory, using this kind of device could improve, for example, flash drives and so forth. You can make, they only discovered these at the nanoscale. Chua actually was the one who discovered in principle they must exist, but the group in Hewlett-Packard were the ones who first published in Nature in 2008, it's only a couple of years ago, the first evidence that you could construct a memristor. And several years, well, about a year after that, they showed that you could build circuits, chips with memristors, which could process and also memorize information. And they were 4 to 8 times smaller than current chips. Now, that's interesting enough, if you like, just from the point of view of the computer industry. But the idea of an electronic component with memory is, of course, exactly what a neuron and synapse is. And so recent research, just this last year, there have been several papers now constructing these switch-point apparatus chips on the base of using memristors, and showing that they pretty much mimic the activities of neurons during basic aspects of learning, for example, neuroplasticity changes. They're still very early days, but in principle, these would be the components, sort of components that you use in order to build a chip that functions just like a brain. Okay. This was the paper from the Hewlett-Packard group where they find the missing memristor that I've just mentioned. And this was the time course, 2009. Hewlett-Packard found that you could stack 4 times 8 more memory on a chip. As I say, this is very important from their point of view, from things like flash drives. Solid-state memory can make it much smaller than conventional technology. And they've also just recently joined with Hynix Semiconductors to start manufacturing these things. This was the last point that I made. It's just a paper came out in Nanoletters. It's not the only one I've seen. I've seen another one where they're using these cross-switching memristor-type chips in order to mimic neuron and synapse activity, and showing that you can get changes within these chips that are very similar to what you would see in neuronal circuits. So it's pretty exciting, and you can imagine with the huge input from the sort of computing fraternity that this kind of technology may well take off big time in the next 10, 20 years. Yeah, I don't necessarily want you to read all this. I just found it kind of interesting. There's a huge amount of concern, particularly in the US, that the CIA is going to be developing mind control chips. This recent meeting of the foil hat wearers, you can read it for yourself. This is what the public relations director of the CIA, Randall Messerschmitt, down the bottom here, he says, yeah, it's true, only small electrical charges are needed to simulate or stimulate the brain. That is not the whole story. To actually change the average American mind on anything at all would require at least the voltage of a car battery. And because of the size and weight issues involved, that's just not practical. At least he had a sense of humor. It doesn't stop, however, individuals being extremely worried, the foil hat wearer brigade, that there is going to be development of mind control chips. And yeah, I mean, the technology in theory isn't completely out of reach, but it would be a long time before we got there. So what about organic brains? Could we actually create anything that functions pretty much like our current biology? Yes, we already can. You can obviously culture neuronal stem cells, and you can make them into neural circuits. But in a sense, it's going to take an awful long time to develop something that will be performing any very complex functions. On the other hand, you could conceive of developing organic-based, but nevertheless nanotechnology-based brains. I'll just give you an example. I mean, the basic unit currently is a nerve cell with dendrites and axon, and you can generate that with a gold nanoparticle bound to conducting polymer strands, for example. The axon, it was different sizes here, that can be conducting polymer strands, receiving dendrites, conducting polymer strands, ending in a gold particle for conduction, and the synapse can be the intersection between polymers and electrolytes. And you can effectively duplicate, but at the nanoscale, with these existing technologies, as I say, in molecular physics and polymer chemistry, something that is constructed, at least, like a neural network. And that's the kind of thing that you could come up with. The advantages, one of the advantages of these kind of networks is that you can actually have bidirectional communication, which of course in neurons you can't, it's one direction. The axon only normally will propagate in one direction when it's functioning. So yeah, who knows? Down the line, you know, when you want a new brain, perhaps it is possible. For me, though, I think the key advances won't be in this kind of area. They will be in linking up brain-like chips to our existing brain circuits. So the interface between brain-like chips and our brains will be the key area of advance, because you can obviously program chips with a huge amount of information. If you could actually get that information read out by the brain, then you can almost imagine having a sort of, as you'll see in a minute, Google Inside or whatever, or information that you want as it is sort of plugged in. Clearly, from what I've been saying, though, it won't surprise you to know that there's been quite an increase in the whole area of neuroethics, because we're starting to talk about aspects of controlling, if you like, and understanding humans that are unprecedented. Even from the reading and controlling the thoughts of others, are you guilty or not? And also, of course, I haven't mentioned it particularly, but most of what we're trying to do is for therapeutic purposes, but whatever you do for that can also be used for improving on normal function. And how are we going to deal with that kind of thing if we want to generate the kind of Robocop type scenario? And if you believe, as we must do really, that consciousness evolves naturally from complex neuronal-based systems, then down the line we may have to fight this one. Will we actually be generating machines capable of some degree of consciousness and therefore feelings? Yeah, this isn't 25 years away, but it's the principles, in a sense, are going to be there. It'll be very interesting to see what happens when we do have the technology to be able to sort of generate large-scale neuronal-type networks and what that means. So, in summary, advances in brain recording technology and computational approaches will increasingly allow interpretation of mental activity. And yep, there's going to be the guy on the street corner who's going to be offering budget brain scans. There'll be an awful lot of fraud and all sorts of things going on. But nevertheless, it is going to be increasingly, we are going to be able to see what people are thinking and feeling just by recording the activity of their brains. And of course, our thoughts may be used against us. Perhaps every courtroom will have the witness box with a real-time fMRI machine or something like it. Or alternatively, there's the button that connects to the inner ear of all the workers just to see what they're thinking and feeling. As I've tried to intimate, I actually personally believe that the whole area of biofeedback is going to be extremely important going forward for helping us, in a sense, help ourselves treat damaged and dysfunctional brains. It's still a bit of a quack area in many ways, but when the hard science really comes to back it up and we begin to understand more of what we're doing, then it's a very real possibility. I mean, the brain is extremely adaptable and we seem to be able to control it ourselves. And so you've got to be able, potentially, to use that in a beneficial way. Of course, there is the other side, is that, of course, not only could you use it for beneficial purposes, but you could also use it for perhaps less constructive ones as well, a two-edged sword. We will be able to control external devices using brain-machine interfaces. Yep, the Source's apprentice, Mickey, did get into trouble when he was trying to control the cleaning of the kitchen. And yep, perhaps we can have robots we are able to control with our own thoughts to do things around the house. I suspect that the first real applications of these brain-machine interfaces are likely to be in the gaming area. It's such big business, and the idea that you can control games with your thought patterns has a certain degree of appeal, as you've already seen from the iPhone application. Of course, going forward, if we already have enough trouble in marital strife, who's going to control the remote? But imagine if both of you can actually control devices around the house. Who's actually going to have the dominant control? I mean, I say this flippantly, but you're going to have to work these kind of things out. If you can control machines in your local environment, and both of you can do it, it's fine when there's only one person doing it, but as soon as you've got two people doing it or more, and they have different views, then there's going to be some form of conflict. So it might actually make things worse. Computers will come more like brains, and yeah, maybe, yeah. We're going to end up with computer psychiatrists. I sincerely hope not, but Neuroprosthetics, as I've already intimated, will become far more of a routine, and not just for replacement of artificial limbs, but also replacing functions that we've, for one reason or another, are unable to do. So it isn't out of the question that we will have, as I've already sort of intimated, interfaces with complex chips that may indeed function like brains. You can almost sort of put a module in for languages or something to improve on what the brain has or doesn't have, including a Google implant for those of us who want to know more than we perhaps really ought. And yeah, maybe some of us would prefer to have something where you just switched it all off. Yeah, I can, as this lady is expressing, maybe some of what I've been saying gives you this kind of sentiment. Run, you know, this is neuroscience gone crazy. It's not that. It's going to be a really exciting period, both in neuroscience but also in computing, and they will go hand in hand. And let's just hope, though, that we can use it very much for the benefit of mankind, and not necessarily to go down some of the kinds of lines that I've suggested this kind of technology will be usable on. But I can assure you that whoever would give this lecture in 20 years' time, a lot of these things will actually be fairly routine. And our brains will no longer be that sort of private place that we carry around with us, and nobody that we don't want to can actually understand what we are thinking and feeling. Thank you very much. I'm quite happy to take some questions if anyone's got some questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. Excellent speech, by the way. The question comes up, you've been talking about elements that externally affect the brain, that we as humans start to invent, that affect the brain as such. What about the theory, which my background is from Germany, that HR, that some aspects of dyslexia, for instance, seem to be the first time that we are experiencing some evolutionary progress in the brain itself? Have you got anything to say in that area?
Well, of course, yeah, there obviously have been changes going on in the brain over thousands of years, but they're obviously extremely slow by comparison with the kinds of things that we're now potentially talking about altering brain function with. And I don't know going forward. I mean, it's not normally something that you could argue that perhaps some of the problems that we have now are, the result of the way the brain has evolved, and we're having to deal with that. But unfortunately, the only way we've got to deal with it is a fairly artificial way, because any thought of trying to re-evolve the brain, apart from what I've been discussing on the biofeedback, but then the biofeedback's going to sort of allow an individual to change their own brain, but that's not going to be passed on. Probably not going to be passed on to the next generation. It depends on whether you believe that sort of epigenetic effects can be passed on routinely to the next generation or not. But currently, most people would say that maybe a little bit, but not very much. So I think that yes, there is brain evolution going on, but I don't think it's going to have a major impact going forward. We've got to deal with the problems that we've already got.
I'm not sure where to start. Traditionally, computers, as they've been developed, have done complex arithmetical tasks and huge data searches and so on, which computers fundamentally are good at and human beings can do in principle, but not in practice. If we come to try and make computers more like human brains, which human brain are we going to make it like? Are we going to make it like a Hitler? Are we going to make it like a Tony Blair? Or what are we going to do?
I think, what we're trying to understand is general principles of how all brains work, not how a particular individual's brain works, although that's interesting in the sense that when you actually look at differences in the way brains work and how they produce different behaviors and so forth, that's interesting. But when you're trying to create as it were, some kind of device, you're going to be looking at the general principles about the way that the majority of brains work and build up on that. And of course, there's no actual necessity when I'm talking about reconstructing brains that anyone would want to necessarily construct something that functions just like our current brain does. We just have the principles upon which nervous systems function, and that we can program devices to function in a similar way. What we actually do with that, how we program them, what we want them to do, is an open question.
Before I start, did you some years ago give a talk on can the pharmaceutical industry satisfy our needs, our pleasure needs, or not?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Well, to go back to that, well, two things. First of all, this seems very pedantic in some ways, because you're going for making people have what perhaps the state wants us to have. But meanwhile, two things. First of all, Professor Greenfield, Lady Greenfield, she gave a lecture at the Psychological Society some time ago, saying that if we play games and don't stimulate our brains, people can go onto the autistic spectrum. And secondly, this says nothing about pleasure. I mean, you've got all these things, but we would really ask you, couldn't you ask the government to put oxytocin and cocaine in the corner shop?
Well, because I actually covered that kind of area in the last lecture I gave, and the one that you mentioned. I decided to leave out happy pills from this one. In fact, you're absolutely right. We are very much getting to the point where we're understanding enough about, in fact, endogenous systems like oxytocin, which is one of my own particular areas, and we've just shown recently that nasal sprays with oxytocin can increase emotional empathy, for example, in humans, and there are a whole raft of studies showing that it can affect pro-social behaviors, and it's an empathogen, as they call, just like ecstasy, but without the addiction issue. And yeah, I mean, there is certainly, we are going to be able to develop chemical-based treatments which will improve the way that we feel about ourselves and the world and other people, and that will certainly be another advance. I decided not to talk about the chemical side in this thing, but then you've got this whole, the talk was about, meeting the demands of the hedonistic society, and we are a hedonistic society. A lot of the things I'm talking about here, I mean, yeah, we'd all like to have Google just sitting there, I can't remember that, bang, the information is at our fingertips, and a lot of things will be great from that point of view, but of course, along with that kind of technology, you get the other side that will have to come with it. You can abuse it as well, and it is going to be a problem deciding what should and shouldn't be developed. I mean, the rule, of course, for us who are working in this field is we're trying to deal with humans that have problems, psychiatric, or in fact even potentially just life. They can't cope with life. But naturally, the kinds of things that we're going to develop, just like Viagra, developed for treatment of impotence, but naturally it's mostly sold as a leisure compound, and that's what will unfortunately happen with anything that we develop along these lines. And that's why the kind of neuroethics and what we do with these technologies is going to be a very serious issue for humans to deal with, because we are going to be able to develop some quite mind-boggling ways of controlling our brains and making life, as it were, artificially good, which...
Do you think that there might be something like unintended consequences in the fact that people will, unless you stimulate your brain as well as putting things into it, people could become actually a little bit not as bright as they are now?
Well, taking shortcuts does often tend to result in you get a sting in the tail down the line, and there's no real sort of proper alternative to trying to learn how to do things yourself. But there are a large number of things which particularly we use computers for, which frankly we're not well designed to remember masses of information. And so they've been very useful tools to help us. But now suddenly those tools are actually getting close to, potentially being incorporated into our own makeup, and how do we deal with that kind of thing? But I mean, if I could cure depression at a stroke with a pill that made everybody feel good about themselves and the world, would I get a Nobel Prize? Think about it. I mean, everybody would be the same, right? We kind of want ups and downs, and it's back to the kind of the Huxley concept of soma. The idea that you end up with a society that doesn't have real highs and doesn't have any lows, and what kind of society is that? And I think most of us would like society as it is, but.
I was just wondering if you could give your opinion on what you feel might be the biggest impediments or roadblocks or obstructions to developing neuroscience, and perhaps you could give your opinion on how you feel society, government and private individuals could best remove those.
Well, one that you're always going to have to say is money. Without funding.
But money only does.
Yeah, no. Yeah, and you have to target it as well. You have to decide what your priorities are and put the money where you feel the most benefit is going to be. And that clearly is a very important role, not only for government, but also for the public influencing government. It's actually, there are other aspects. I mean, I'm, for example, going to be hopefully working in China, and I probably may well move there. And one of the problems that we do have is when you want to develop new therapies, new drugs, the regulations are pretty tough. I mean, I'm not saying you should go off and do whatever you like, but the regulatory processes in the US and Europe are often manacles. And other countries, you've got to have ethical committees, you've got to have these kind of things. But it's very important, that, especially with the speed of advance, that we're actually able to do the kinds of experiments and bring them into the human domain, particularly as soon as possible, without it taking years to get through ethics committees. So I'm not saying you shouldn't have them, but I think that whole kind of aspect needs to be looked at and streamlined and regulated in a way where you're trying to speed things up rather than slow things down.
Well, if you could do one or two things, if you had the power, what would you do? What do you think of if you could remove an impediment, what would you remove today?
Well, that would be one, the ethics committees. I mean, give an example of the work on oxytocin that I'm involved in. The only experiment I've done with the nasal spray was actually done in Germany, and that was hard enough. There haven't been a single study done in the UK, not a single one has been given permission. There is one now, and I'm hopefully working with the group that is doing that. And yet there have been 20, 30 studies in Europe and other places. So I think that there is, and this is a naturally occurring substance in the brain, and no study has reported any side effect. Major side, a headache maybe, but a bit of rhinitis. But that, if you like, can put back science a long, long way. That single thing. And the other thing, though, is very much the way science is funded. Having to sort of keep getting new funding every 3 to 5 years. I mean, a lot of the kind of projects I'm talking about here are going to take a long time to develop. We don't really have a good way of funding long-term science like this. And I kind of intimated as well that the chip technology, the computer guys, they're commercially driven, and they will develop them way faster than the neuroscience will advance. So I do think that the way we fund science, the way we gain approval for doing scientific experiments are key areas going forward. We don't want to hamper. We've got the scientists, we've got the brains, and I don't think there's any shortage of that. The problem is not always giving them the tools, the ability to do what they need to do.
Is your imminent move to China a sign of the brain drain?
Well, it's a number of things. Yeah, in this country things are bad. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It's not the only country where they are. And you know, China has a lot of money and resources, and most importantly, they have a real enthusiasm for advance. And you know, it's an opportunity. I wouldn't say it's necessarily something everybody's going to want to do, but for me, they really have a lot going for them. And the kinds of experiments I want to do will be a lot easier to do in China than they are in Europe. And I believe that, therefore I'm going to make a much faster advance, as well as get better resources, to be frank. And they also, of course, have computational scientists, and maths is kind of one of their strongest areas. So exactly the kind of environment that I would want to be in. Not to say it's not strong here too, but personal circumstances also influence this, but nevertheless.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Do you think in the future, seeing as we are just conscious beings for us materialists, that if we could move our consciousness into computers, that this could be a possibility of immortality and possibly sort of preventing death?
Yeah, now we are moving into the science fiction. I mean, if we were sort of talking about something that we wouldn't have a priority for doing, that would be one of them. I can't immediately see. I mean, we can obviously take a lot of information ultimately from people's brains and store it. Whether that we could even store it on a system that kind of functioned like a brain, and yes, it would effectively be immortal as long as there's power around. But to say that it would actually be a full representation of your conscious self would be a really major step. We would perhaps be able to transfer a lot of information from a brain, but that would be about it. And that really is a long way, down the line. If you want to do that, I mean, you might say you'd want to do that for a brain like Einstein's or whatever. But again, I think it would be, given that we have limited resources, it's not likely to be something that we would immediately want to do.
Thank you again for the lecture. I've just got a simple question. I'm not sure, is it simple? Probably not. We've seen a lot of diagrams of people being connected to machines in one form or another. What about people being connected to people? I mean, electrodes acting as both inputs and outputs. Has anything been done along those lines? And of somehow taking the output, the thinking process, someone thinking about, I don't know, horses or whatever, and seeing whether that is received in any form intelligible at all to the other person. And as a corollary, totally different area, the whole business of consciousness, I know it's more philosophical perhaps than neuroscience, but do you subscribe to the view that it's the last barrier that science has to face?
Well, in terms of one human communicating to another, yeah, you might conceive of situations, particularly where individuals are unable to communicate by routine means, that this might be a possibility. It's still going to be probably through some form of machine, because you've got to interpret the signals in order to then transmit them to the other individual. Indeed, I gave a picture, a rather humorous picture, but nevertheless, that was in principle what was going on there. That this is a way of taking your brain waves, having them analyzed, and then passing the information in a structured way onto someone else. But in this case, you would be actually, in a sense, needing to stimulate the brain of the other person in order to give them the thought processes that the first person was producing. Again, this is a kind of thing where, yeah, you could see it possibly having a very limited advantage where, as I say, there are communication problems. But I don't see it as something, I mean, we have good ways of communicating with one another, you know. Hopefully we're going to keep using those forms of communication. To try and find other ways of doing it, I think would be, I wouldn't say a waste of money, but it would be something that would not be very high on at least my priority list.
Consciousness?
Consciousness? In the sense that
there's a lot of work that's being written by people in nanoscale and others. What is the nature of consciousness? The last boundary, barrier, breakthrough area of science. You've mentioned it a number of times.
I think the, yeah, sorry, yes. If you mean will we understand what it is, yeah. I think we're already making advances on that in terms of understanding how the brain differs in the way it works when you're conscious of something as opposed to unconsciously processing it. I'm not saying that necessarily gives you the secret about what consciousness is, but what is clear is just the brain working in rather different ways, but using exactly the same structures very often in the brain that can actually process information unconsciously. And we think that, you know, these kind of things I've been talking about, oscillatory rhythms and so forth, are very important for, as it were, synchronizing the brain in such a way that something, as it were, emerges into consciousness. So we'll begin at least to understand, if you like, the mechanics of what consciousness or conscious awareness is, as opposed to an unconscious processing of information. That information in itself won't necessarily make you, be able to create a machine that is functioning, is potentially capable of consciousness, but it will at least show us the principles upon which large neuronal networks need to change the way they are communicating in order for something to reach what we experience as a conscious awareness. I think maybe one last question, and then, because I appreciate we've gone quite a long way over time, and I'm sure some of you will.
Since we've been talking a bit about consciousness, would it not be a simple observation that the mind and body are objects in our consciousness? And if you start looking for consciousness inside the mind or the body, then you're going about things the wrong way. It's a bit like the man who opens up a radio hoping to find an orchestra inside that's playing the music.
Yeah, part of the problem is, I'm sure you're aware of the sort of, Cartesian fallacy and so forth, is that we tend to have this idea of consciousness as a separate entity, and it's not a very useful way of visualizing it at all. It is simply an emergent property, as far as I'm concerned anyway, of the way that large-scale neural networks function in different circumstances. It's not a separate thing. As soon as you make it into a separate thing, then it becomes very hard to conceptualize. And yeah, a lot of people are not happy with that, because all you're then saying is that it's simply a sort of, it comes out of a biological system, and it's, for example, one of the key questions we're often asked is, are animals capable of consciousness? And other animals, that is. A lot of people, a lot of neuroscientists still argue that no, that it's only something that's generated by the human brain, but I'm not one of those. As far as I'm concerned, it's something that any complex neural-based system is capable of generating, at least at some level, bearing in mind that there are many different levels of consciousness. But I don't think it's useful to sort of put it outside the box, outside the body, and sort of, what is it? It's simply something that emerges, and it's very useful. Clearly, we've evolved the use of it because it helps us, make decisions, think about things, plan, and so forth. And it's evolved out of and therefore we've developed our nervous systems appropriately to actually, encourage this particular form of brain activity. I think we better stop there, since I've kept you for a long time, and you probably think I've got another 2 hours.